Hello! Today I'm delving into some Final Fantasy lore with a look at the recurring summonable being of Ifrit. Now, I have an episode from quite a while ago that charts the evolution of Final Fantasy summons in quite a broad, generalised sense, but for a while now I've wanted to delve a bit deeper into these respective entities, as I think they highlight the wealth of real-world cultures and mythologies that the Final Fantasy games draw upon, and I think they're used really effectively and in interesting ways in how they impact themes, setting, combat, and of course story. And Ifrit in particular is a good one to kick off with, because along with its counterpart Shiva, it's a creature that has consistently appeared in the games and consistently featured in the stories to some degree or another, and is among the first to spring to mind for many Final Fantasy fans when they think about the summonable beings in these games. So, jumping right in, it's worth looking primarily at the cultural origins of the Ifrit, because it really helps contextualise the creature's appearance, its elemental design, and the fleeting interactions and inclusions that we have with it in various Final Fantasy games and in various parts of the stories. So, the earliest real-world references of the Ifrit resides in Arabian mythology and folklore, and much like other ancient polytheistic belief systems, such as Greek mythology or Shintoism, they used spirits and hierarchies of supernatural deities to explain the external world, to conjure creation stories, and create cautionary tales that would inform social conduct and moral guidance. So looking at Ifrits within this, and specifically, they are a type of Jinn, or spirit, that much like the Shintoist Kami, or the Norse Disir, they feature as lesser beings in folklore that can appear to both help or hinder human beings. And depending on the interpretation or tale, they can be considered fortuitous assets or villainous tricksters, with prime examples of the former being the two Jinn, or Latinized to genie, that feature in Aladdin's tale in Arabian Nights, and an example of the latter being the Ifrit who appears in the Quran to hinder the Prophet Muhammad and has to be defeated by the angel Gabriel. So, in summary, they are very interesting and multifaceted creatures from pagan and Islamic traditions, and turning to Final Fantasy and looking at what we know from these descriptions of them, we can see how this has been relatively faithfully applied to the creature's evolution and appearances in these various games. For example, in almost every folkloric tale, the Ifrit is associated with smoke and fire, whether that's simply materialising from smoke, such as it does in Aladdin, or being comprised entirely of this element. And so, looking at the Ifrit and its earliest appearances in Final Fantasy III, all the way through to later games, such as Final Fantasy 15 and 16, we can see the consistent elemental association with fire and its utilisation of skills like Hellfire and Inferno. Another interesting thing about Ifrits in folklore is their ability to be summoned by humans. So again, most famously in the story of Aladdin and the lamp, but elsewhere through Middle Eastern mythology, we see them being utilised by humans to do their bidding, whether it's exacting revenge or granting wishes. So perhaps more than most summonable deities in the Final Fantasy pantheon, Ifrit is most befitting of the task because it's so faithful to the source material and the literary analogues of where we find the creatures elsewhere. Moving on, and looking specifically at the design and role of Ifrit in the games, what I really like is how the game creators, whether consciously or not, drew on the fallibility and specifically the pridefulness of the source material and the original Ifrit when they created the Final Fantasy game. And I think this is most apparent in Final Fantasy VIII, where in the Fire Cavern, Ifrit questions the worthiness of these human beings trying to obtain him. Again, in Final Fantasy X, he is obtained by trial and by proving one's worth at Kilika Temple. And much more apparently, in Final Fantasy XV, we see Ifrit as a prideful and fickle, domineering god figure who goes from ruling over humans to waging war against them. And perhaps even more interesting than that is, much like the Lucifer story, where the angel is cast out of heaven for opposing God, and the Islamic analogue, where the Jinn Iblis is cast out for opposing Allah, we have the Ifrit of Final Fantasy XV being cast out by Bahamut, which creates some rather interesting comparisons there, once again with earlier texts, although Ifrit being presented as a god in Final Fantasy XV is quite a way away from its status and station in these earlier source texts. And it's much more an intermediary spirit, like the Kami, than an actual creator figure. So we see that Ifrit can be both friend and foe, a benevolent guardian figure and a prideful foil to mankind. But turning finally to its design in Final Fantasy, it's another interesting chronology to chart and adaptation to consider, because firstly, from the outset we can see that Square have really committed to the more negative connotations and demonic interpretation of the Ifrit over the course of the series. And while the design does change in each game, in almost every instance Ifrit has long curved horns and demonic features such as glowing red or yellow eyes and bared teeth and stuff like that. There's also clear connotations to its status as a creature comprised almost entirely of fire, since not only is its elemental status and physical attacks fire-based, but it almost always emerges from flames when it's summoned, and the hues and colour palettes used in each design generally consist of yellows, reds and warm browns in almost every game. So all in all, I really like Ifrit. I think it utilises its source material very faithfully, and indeed perhaps more faithfully than any other summonable being in the game. But I also like how within the context of Final Fantasy and within these games, it's taken on a life of its own, thematically and narratively. And for example, its symbiotic relationship with Shiva, even though these two creatures are from completely different cultures and religious belief systems, it's interesting that this symbiotic relationship with Shiva has grown from simply a gameplay elemental opposition to a fully fledged tragic romance in the lore and backstory of Final Fantasy XV. And from what we've seen of Final Fantasy XVI so far, it does look like it's continuing this trend of summons being increasingly relevant and important to core story. So it will be interesting to see how and why that evolves in future. So that wraps up my brief look at Ifrit. If you're interested in my extensive look at the summons and the broad arc in Final Fantasy lore, I'll drop a link to that below. And if you enjoyed the episode, I will be doing some more on the summons in the coming weeks and months. So do consider subscribing, or check back in a little while to see some more origin stories.